In the outer rim of the Andromeda Spiral, where civilized space gives way to the sort of neighbourhoods where even pirates check their locks twice, lived the Velfari. These particular aliens had turned paranoia into an art form so refined that they made hermit crabs look like social butterflies. For roughly 3,000 standard years, they had perfected the galactic equivalent of crossing the street when they saw other species coming. The Velfari weren't antisocial without reason, mind you. Evolution had gifted them with several traits that made trusting others about as appealing as gargling with acid. First, they were natural telepaths, which meant they could hear every petty thought, lie, and mental grocery list of anyone within a 50-metre radius. Second, they possessed crystalline bone plates that could deflect most energy weapons, making them walking tanks with abandonment issues. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they had the charming ability to sense deception through biochemical changes in other beings' pheromone signatures. Imagine being able to smell every white lie, every social pleasantry, every "I'm fine" when someone clearly wasn't. After a few centuries of that particular sensory gift, most species would either go insane or become reclusive. The Velfari chose option 2, and built an entire civilization around the principle that everyone else in the galaxy was probably lying about something. Their homeworld, Velfari Prime, existed in a state of splendid isolation that would make medieval kingdoms jealous. No tourists, no trade delegations, no door-to-door energy field salesmen. The planet's defense grid could turn approaching ships into very expensive fireworks before their pilots could finish saying, "We come in peace." The Velfari had heard that phrase approximately 47,000 times in their recorded history, and exactly 0 of those encounters had ended with actual peace. But even the most paranoid species had to reproduce, and here's where things got cosmically complicated. Velfari young, called cubs, were born with an unusual biological requirement that made helicopter parenting look relaxed. Each cub needed to form what they called a soul bond within 7 solar cycles of birth, or they would simply fade. Not die in any dramatic fashion, mind you. They would just lose interest in existing, stop eating, stop moving, and eventually stop breathing. It was evolution's way of ensuring that Velfari young only survived if they had proper emotional support, which was either brilliant or cruel, depending on your perspective. For 3 millennia, this system had worked perfectly. Cubs bonded with their parents, grew up healthy and appropriately suspicious of outsiders, and continued the proud tradition of telling the rest of the galaxy to mind its own business. Until Air Prime Nexus of Stars decided to break the streak, the Royal Cub, heir to the Velfari throne and future leader of the most xenophobic species in known space, had been born exactly 6 solar cycles ago. In that time, the little furball had rejected every attempt at bonding with the enthusiasm of a food critic reviewing prison cafeteria meals. Parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, the royal nanny, the backup royal nanny, the backup royal nanny, 3 different priests, a renowned child psychologist, and even the royal chef who made particularly excellent pureed moon fruits had all tried and failed. High Matriarch Seren, ruler of the Velfari and possessor of a maternal instinct that was currently warring with 3,000 years of ingrained xenophobia, stood in the royal nursery watching her heir ignore everyone with the dedication of a professional hermit. The cub was beautiful, in the way that baby apex predators often are. Its crystalline spines caught the light like tiny prisms. Its oversized paws suggested it would grow into something impressively dangerous, and its eyes held the sort of ancient intelligence that made adults uncomfortable. Those same eyes had looked at every Velfari who'd tried to bond with it, and essentially communicated, "Thanks, but no thanks." "High Matriarch," said Ambassador Calum, one of the few progressive voices in Velfari society, which was roughly equivalent to being the optimist on a ship full of pessimists during a meteor shower. "Perhaps we need to consider unconventional options." Serene's mental shield practically crackled with the effort of containing her thoughts. The idea of bringing an outsider, an alien, into contact with their most precious heir went against every instinct her species had developed. It was like suggesting they invite a tornado to redecorate the palace. But the alternative was watching the royal bloodline end because a baby was too picky about its emotional support system. "Contact the Intergalactic Mediation Bureau," Serene finally said, the words tasting like bitter medicine. "Tell them we need someone so completely foreign to our ways that our heir might actually find them interesting." Calum's surprise leaked through his mental shields like water through a cracked dam. In 3,000 years, the Velfari had never asked for outside help. They'd rather have solved problems by hitting them repeatedly with ceremonial weapons. "High Matriarch, are you certain?" The political ramifications alone. Serene looked at the cub, who had somehow managed to get itself tangled in its own tail while ignoring a perfectly good toy designed by the finest child development experts in Velfari space. "The political ramifications of letting our heir fade are considerably worse than the embarrassment of admitting we need help," she said dryly. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen?" In the grand tradition of famous last words throughout the galaxy, this question would soon receive a very thorough answer. The message went out through carefully encrypted channels to the Intergalactic Mediation Bureau, an organization that specialized in solving problems that other people had given up on. Their response came back within 2 standard hours, which was either remarkably efficient or suspicious, depending on your level of paranoia. They were sending Captain Ethan Cross, a human xenobiologist with a specialty in interspecies behavioral psychology and a track record of succeeding where others had failed. His credentials were impressive, his references glowing, and his species utterly unknown to the Velfari, which was exactly what they'd asked for, and precisely what they were beginning to fear they'd gotten. Captain Ethan Cross arrived on Velfari Prime with all the diplomatic grace of a meteor hitting a tea party. His shuttle touched down in the Royal Landing Bay exactly 17 minutes late, which in Velfari culture was roughly equivalent to showing up to a funeral in clown shoes. The delay, as it turned out, was because he'd spent the approach vector marvelling at the planet's defensive arrays and asking his pilot increasingly technical questions about their energy signatures. "Fascinating stuff," he'd said, completely oblivious to the fact that analysing a species' weapon systems was generally considered either espionage or a declaration of war. You don't see crystalline energy matrices like that outside of theoretical physics papers. When the shuttle doors opened, the assembled Velfari delegation got their first look at humanity's answer to their crisis. What they saw was a creature that violated every principle of survival they'd evolved to respect. Ethan Cross stood roughly 2 meters tall, which was impressive until you realised he had no natural armour, no visible weapons, no energy field generators, and skin so soft it looked like it would tear if someone sneezed too hard. His hair was an unremarkable brown, his eyes were blue instead of the proper glowing amber, and he had the disturbing habit of exposing his teeth in what he apparently considered a friendly gesture. "High Matriarch Serene, I presume?" Ethan said, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting that the Velfari had learned about approximately 30 seconds earlier from their cultural database. "Captain Ethan Cross, Intergalactic Mediation Bureau. Thanks for having me." The hand gesture alone broke 4 different protocols. Velfari didn't touch strangers, primarily because touching someone allowed for deeper telepathic contact, which was roughly equivalent to letting them rummage through your underwear drawer. Seren stared at the offered appendage like it might explode. Captain Cross, she managed, her mental shield working overtime to contain her thoughts about this bizarre, weaponless creature. We appreciate your willingness to help. Ambassador Calum stepped forward, partly to facilitate introductions and partly to prevent any immediate diplomatic incidents. Captain, perhaps you could explain your approach to interspecies behavioural psychology? Ethan's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his job, which was either endearing or terrifying depending on your perspective. Well, the basic principle is that emotional needs are surprisingly universal. Fear, comfort, security, play, attachment, curiosity. The expressions might be different, but the underlying drives are remarkably consistent across species. He paused, looking around at the assembled Velfari, with their crystalline armour plates and glowing eyes. Of course, I've never worked with telepaths before. That's going to be interesting. Interesting? The Velfari delegation exchanged glances that could have powered a small city. Their most guarded state secret, their greatest evolutionary advantage, and this human called it interesting, like it was a new flavour of ice cream. Captain, Seren said carefully, you understand that our heir has rejected bonding attempts from every member of our species, including trained specialists in child psychology and development? Sure, Ethan said, shouldering his equipment bag with casual confidence. But sometimes the problem isn't the child. Sometimes it's the approach. The blasphemy of that statement hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. The suggestion that Velfari child-rearing methods, perfected over millennia, might be somehow inadequate was the sort of thing that usually resulted in exile or worse. They escorted him through the palace corridors, each step a minor violation of security protocols that made the guards twitch. Ethan, meanwhile, kept up a steady stream of observations that ranged from insightful to horrifying. These architectural patterns are designed to contain telepathic resonance, aren't they? Brilliant work. And the lighting spectrum actually promotes calm in developing neural systems. Someone really thought this through. The fact that he could analyse their most carefully guarded environmental design secrets just by walking down a hallway was either impressive or deeply unsettling. Possibly both. They reached the royal nursery, a chamber designed by centuries of tradition and the finest child development experts in Velfari space. Soft lighting, precisely calibrated temperature and humidity, toys crafted from materials that would engage every sense without overwhelming young neural pathways. It was a testament to their species' commitment to nurturing their young. In the centre of it all, Air Prime Nexus of Stars sat in magnificent isolation, steadfastly ignoring a mobile of crystalline star shapes that cost more than most planets' annual budgets. Ethan took one look at the setup and made a sound that might have been appreciation or dismay. Right, he said, setting down his bag. Let's meet the little guy. The Air Prime is not a little guy, Seren said stiffly. This is the future ruler of our people, inheritor of ancient bloodlines, destined to die if we don't figure out why bonding isn't working, Ethan interrupted with the sort of practical directness that made diplomats break out in hives. Mind if I just sit with the kid for a while? Before anyone could explain why that was culturally inappropriate, medically inadvisable, and possibly treasonous, Ethan had lowered himself to the floor near the cub, not close enough to be threatening, but within the range where interaction was possible. The Air Prime looked at him with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of an ancient bloodline and the cosmic significance of a royal destiny. Those eyes studied this strange, soft creature with the sort of intense focus usually reserved for particularly interesting rocks. Then the cub tilted its head with curiosity that was, for the first time in 6 solar cycles, not immediately followed by dismissive disinterest. "Hey there, buddy," Ethan said, his voice dropping to the sort of gentle tone that every parent in the galaxy instinctively recognized, regardless of species. "You having a rough week?" The cub made a small chirping sound. Not the formal vocalizations it had been trained to produce, but something softer, more questioning. Ethan smiled, the expression transforming his unremarkable human features into something that even the paranoid Velfari had to admit looked genuinely warm. "Yeah, I bet you are. All these people trying to tell you how to feel, when to bond, what you're supposed to want. That's got to be exhausting." The royal nursery fell silent, except for the soft hum of environmental systems and the gentle sound of a human having the first real conversation anyone had managed with the heir to the Velfari throne. For the first time since its birth, Air Prime Nexus of Stars scooted closer to someone. Just a few centimetres, but in the context of 6 days of absolute rejection, it might as well have been a declaration of independence. Ambassador Caelum's mental shields flickered with something that might have been hope. High Matriarch Seren found herself holding her breath, afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile connection was forming, and Captain Ethan Cross, xenobiologist and professional optimist, settled in for what he suspected was going to be a very interesting conversation with a baby who just needed someone to treat it like a person instead of a destiny. The breakthrough with Hair Prime Nexus of Stars created what Ambassador Caelum would later describe as cautious optimism, which in Velfari terms was roughly equivalent to throwing a galaxy-wide celebration. The cub had not only approached Ethan, but had actually stayed within conversation range for an entire hour, occasionally making those soft, chirping sounds that seemed to indicate something between curiosity and contentment. High Matriarch Seren watched this development with the sort of careful attention usually reserved for monitoring active volcanoes. Hope was a dangerous emotion for a species that had built their entire civilization around expecting the worst from everyone. "Captain Cross," she said, her formal tone barely concealing what might have been actual relief. "Your initial contact has been promising. However, we must discuss the next phase of the bonding process." Ethan looked up from where he'd been quietly observing the cub's play patterns, which involved a fascinating combination of pouncing on shadows and getting dramatically startled by its own tail. "Next phase. The naming ceremony," Caelum explained, settling into what was clearly going to be a lengthy cultural exposition. "In Velfari tradition, the bond is sealed when the cub accepts its true name. Not the formal designation it received at birth, but the name that will define its essence, its destiny, its connection to the cosmic order." "Right," Ethan said slowly. "And that would be different from Air Prime Nexus of Stars. How exactly?" The question hung in the air like an accusation of cultural ignorance, which it technically was. "The birth designation is merely ceremonial," Seren explained, with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow student. "The true name must capture the cub's essential nature, its role in the grand tapestry of existence, its significance to our people's future. Previous heirs have received names like Void Walker of Infinite Sorrows, Star Crusher born of Ancient Flames, and Silence that Speaks to the Cosmic Deep." Ethan blinked. "Those are substantial names." "Names carry power," Caelum added. "They shape identity, define purpose, establish the spiritual connection between the individual and the universe. The naming ceremony is the most sacred ritual in our culture. And you want me to pick the name? The cub must accept the name from whoever it bonds with, Seren said. Since traditional methods have failed, and you appear to have achieved some level of connection. She trailed off, leaving the implications hanging like a sword made of bureaucracy and cosmic significance. Ethan looked down at the cub, who had managed to get itself tangled in a toy that was probably worth more than his annual salary. The little creature was making soft chirping sounds as it wrestled with crystalline ribbons, occasionally tumbling over in ways that were simultaneously adorable and slightly concerning for the future of galactic diplomacy. "What happens if the cub rejects the name?" he asked. "Then the bonding fails, and..." Calem's mental shields flickered with uncomfortable emotions. "Let's focus on success, shall we?" Over the next several hours, the Velfari provided Ethan with extensive cultural briefings on their naming traditions. He learned about the significance of celestial references, the importance of temporal imagery, the proper incorporation of ancestral honour, and the delicate balance between martial strength and cosmic wisdom that every great name required. It was, by any objective measure, an incredibly sophisticated system that had produced names of genuine beauty and power for thousands of years. It was also, Ethan was beginning to suspect, exactly the wrong approach for this particular cub. He spent time observing the little creature's behaviour, noting patterns that the Velfari had missed in their focus on cosmic significance. The cub didn't respond to grand gestures or formal presentations. It perked up at quiet sounds, gentle movements, simple interactions. When toys were presented with ceremony and explanation, it ignored them. When the same toys were left casually within reach, it investigated with enthusiasm. The cub appears to prefer understated approaches, he mentioned during one of the briefing sessions. "Impossible," said Master Sage Aeon of Contemplated Depths, the palace's chief naming expert. "Royal cubs are drawn to power, to significance, to names that reflect their destined greatness. Perhaps infinite light of shadowed wisdom, or eternal storm born of silent thunder." Ethan watched the cub, who had discovered that its own tale was apparently the most entertaining thing in the known universe. "What about something simpler?" The suggestion created the sort of silence usually associated with natural disasters or diplomatic crises. "Simpler?" Seren repeated, as if the word might be in a foreign language. "Well, the cub seems to respond to gentle sounds. Those little chirps it makes, they sound almost like..." He paused, listening as the cub made another series of soft vocalizations while investigating a fallen leaf that had somehow made its way into the sterile environment of the royal nursery. "They sound like pips," he said finally. "Little pip sounds." If the previous silence had been concerning, this one was actively ominous. The assembled Velfari experts exchanged looks that could have frozen plasma. Captain Cross, Aeon of Contemplated Depths, said with the sort of careful patience usually reserved for the mentally unstable, "You cannot possibly be suggesting we name the heir to the Velfari throne Pip." "Why not?" Ethan asked, with the dangerous innocence of someone who had never heard of 3,000 years of sacred tradition. "It fits. The cub makes Pip sounds when it's happy. It's simple enough for a young mind to understand. And it's personal. Not cosmic, not destiny-laden. Just a name that belongs to this specific little individual." The blasphemy of it was breathtaking. A name without celestial significance, without ancestral honour, without cosmic implications. A name that treated the future ruler of the Velfari like a regular child who happened to make cute sounds. Absolutely not, Seren said flatly. The political ramifications alone would destabilise our entire governmental structure. Our people expect their leaders to bear names of power and significance. Ethan nodded, understanding, then did something that would later be recorded in Velfari history as either the most brilliant or most catastrophic moment of interspecies diplomacy ever witnessed. He knelt down next to the cub and said very quietly, "Hey, Pip." The cub's head snapped up with immediate attention. Those ancient, intelligent eyes focused on Ethan with an intensity that made the air in the nursery practically hum with telepathic energy. "Yeah, that's right," Ethan continued, his voice soft and warm. "Pip. That's you, isn't it? My little Pip." What happened next violated several laws of physics, multiple principles of Velfari psychology, and at least 4 different diplomatic protocols. The cub bonded. Not the gradual, careful process that traditional ceremonies required, but an instantaneous, complete, overwhelming connection that sent telepathic shockwaves through every sensitive mind in the palace. The little creature practically launched itself toward Ethan, chirping with joy and radiating the sort of pure, uncomplicated happiness that the Velfari hadn't felt from their heir in 6 increasingly desperate days. For the first time since its birth, Air Prime Nexus of Stars was content, and it wanted everyone to know that its name, its real name, was Pip. The silence that followed was the sort that usually preceded either celebrations or executions, and nobody in the room was entirely sure which way this particular moment was going to tip. The bond between Pip and Captain Ethan Cross didn't just solve the Velfari succession crisis. It obliterated it so thoroughly that the crisis looked like a minor administrative hiccup in comparison to what came next. Within hours of the naming ceremony, Pip began demonstrating abilities that made the palace's child development experts question everything they thought they knew about their own species. The cub's telepathic range expanded dramatically, its cognitive development accelerated, and most remarkably, it began exhibiting what could only be described as emotional intelligence that transcended species barriers. Its unprecedented, Master Sage, Aeon of Contemplated Depths admitted, watching Pip demonstrate perfect comprehension of both Velfari ceremonial gestures and human facial expressions. The bonding has unlocked potential we didn't even know existed. High Matriarch Seren observed this development with the sort of careful analysis that had kept her species alive for millennia. The simple act of treating their heir like an individual rather than a cosmic destiny had produced results that centuries of traditional methods had failed to achieve. "Captain Cross," she said, finding herself using a tone she hadn't employed in diplomatic discussions for decades. "Your approach has been illuminating." Ethan, who was currently engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with Pip about the relative merits of different coloured building blocks, looked up with mild surprise. "Oh, this isn't really my approach. This is just being around kids. They're people, you know. Small people with big feelings and limited vocabulary, but still people." The revolutionary implications of that statement rippled through the assembled Velfari leadership like seismic waves. For 3,000 years, they had approached child rearing as a process of moulding future leaders, shaping cosmic destiny, fulfilling predetermined roles. The idea that children might simply be individuals deserving of respect and understanding was so foreign it bordered on philosophical heresy. And yet, the evidence was literally purring in front of them. Ambassador Calum, whose progressive tendencies had always made him slightly suspect among his peers, found himself voicing thoughts that would have been unthinkable days earlier. "Perhaps our isolation has cost us more than we realized. If this human could understand our heir better than we could." He didn't finish the sentence, But he didn't need to. The implications were as clear as they were uncomfortable. Over the following weeks, something unprecedented happened in Velfari space. For the first time in their recorded history, they began asking questions about the outside galaxy. Not defensive intelligence gathering or threat assessment, but genuine curiosity about other species, other approaches to child development, other ways of understanding the universe. Pip, thriving under the dual influence of Velfari culture and human practicality, became a living bridge between worldviews. The cub learned to speak both the ancient ceremonial tongue of its people and what Ethan cheerfully called baby talk, switching between cosmic pronouncements and simple requests for snacks with equal facility. Air Prime Pip requests sustenance, the cub would announce with formal dignity, then immediately add, "Please?" The purple ones taste better. The political ramifications were as complex as they were inevitable. The Velfari Council of Elders spent weeks debating whether to officially recognise Pip as a legitimate royal name, or maintain the formal Air Prime Nexus of Stars for ceremonial purposes. The compromise they reached satisfied no one and confused everyone. The heir would be known as Air Prime Pip, called Nexus of Stars, beloved of simple truths. But the real change went deeper than names or titles. For the first time in millennia, the Velfari began cautiously, carefully, opening diplomatic channels with other species. Not because they trusted them, but because they had learned that understanding didn't require trust, and sometimes the most foreign perspective could provide the clearest insight. Captain Ethan Cross became the first non-Velfari to be granted permanent diplomatic status, though he suspected this had less to do with his professional qualifications and more to do with Pip's tendency to become inconsolable whenever he tried to leave. Years later, when Pip had grown into a leader who could negotiate with alien dignitaries in the morning and still ask for bedtime stories in the evening, historians would debate the exact moment when Velfari isolationism ended. Some pointed to the first trade agreements, others to the cultural exchange programs, still others to the gradual dismantling of their planetary defense grid. But Ethan knew the truth. The galaxy's most paranoid species had learned to trust the moment a human looked at their most precious heir and saw not a cosmic destiny or a political symbol, but simply a baby who needed someone to care enough to give it a name that fit. Sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the smallest acts of recognition. Sometimes changing the galaxy is as simple as calling someone by a name they actually like. And sometimes the most human thing you can do is treat someone else like a person, regardless of how many legs, eyes, or crystalline armor plates they happen to have.